The morning Susan Bell rode into Coldwater Creek, Colorado. The temperature was dropping fast enough to ice the mud on Main Street, and not a single soul came out to greet her. She had expected that. She had expected a great many things about the frontier, having read every pamphlet and newspaper column she could find back in Philadelphia, but she had not expected the silence to have such weight to it. It pressed down on her shoulders like a hand, firm and unyielding, and she sat a little straighter in the saddle because of it. She was 24 years old, recently widowed, possessed of a small inheritance, a stubbornness that her mother had always called her worst quality and her father had always called her best, and she had come to the Colorado Territory in the autumn of 1879 to start a life that was entirely her own. The town of Coldwater Creek was not much to look at. A general store, a land office, a livery stable that leaned slightly to the east as though listening for something, a saloon with a hand-painted sign that read Billings House in red letters that had faded to something closer to pink, a church that was either under construction or falling apart, she could not tell which, and a scattering of homes behind these main buildings like afterthoughts. The mountains behind everything were enormous and white at the tops, and so close-seeming that Susan had to remind herself they were still many miles off. She dismounted at the livery stable and led her horse inside. A boy of about 14 looked up from a bucket of oats. "Boarding?" he asked. "Yes, please," she said, "and I would like her brushed down. She has had a long 2 days." The boy nodded and took the reins. Susan pulled her saddlebag over one shoulder and stepped back out into the cold. She needed to find the land office. She had a letter of correspondence with a Mr. Aldous Fitch, who had sold her 40 acres on the eastern slope of the range through a proxy arrangement, and she needed to collect the deed and understand exactly what 40 acres in Colorado looked like in person versus on a page. Mr. Fitch turned out to be a round, pink-faced man in his 50s who seemed genuinely surprised to see her, then seemed genuinely surprised to be surprised, then recovered himself and shook her hand with something approaching respect. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "we did not expect you until next week." "I made good time," she said pleasantly. "I would like to see the deed, please, and I would like someone to take me out to the property before the light goes." Fitch hesitated. "The thing is, Mrs. Bell, your property sits close to the upper range. There's a man up there been there going on 6 years now. He traps mostly, keeps to himself. Some of the local folks don't go up that way without some arrangement." Susan looked at him evenly. "Is this man a danger to me?" "Not as such," Fitch said carefully. "He's just, well, he is what some people call difficult." "I have dealt with difficult men before," she said. "The deed, please." She had the deed in her hand within the hour. And within 2 hours, she had borrowed a wagon from the livery boy's father and was driving herself up the eastern slope road with a hand-drawn map on her knee and a second wool coat buckled over the first. The land was extraordinary. She had not been prepared for that either. The aspens had already gone gold, and the light through them was the color of something you might dream about and fail to fully recall upon waking. The creek for which the town was named ran along the northern edge of her property in a quick silver line, and the soil, she stopped and crouched and pressed her fingers into it, was dark and dense and good. She could smell it the way her father had taught her to smell soil, and it was good. She was standing at the northern boundary marker, a stake with orange ribbon tied to it that Mr. Fitch had described, when she heard the sound. It was not loud. It was the sound of something very large moving through underbrush with the kind of practiced quiet that made the sound noticeable precisely, because it was not quite silent. Susan straightened and looked north, toward the tree line. The man who stepped out of the aspens was the largest human being she had ever seen in her life. He stood well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the bulk of his coat seem like a reasonable fit rather than an exaggeration. His beard was dark and full, and his hair fell to the collar of his coat. He carried a long rifle loose in one hand the way A different man might carry a walking stick. His eyes, which were the first thing she was able to focus on clearly, were a shade of gray-green that she would have struggled to name with any paint she had ever used. He was, she would estimate later, somewhere near 30 years of age, possibly a year or two more. He looked at her. She looked at him. He grunted. It was a single sound, low and declarative, the vocal equivalent of a nod. A greeting, she understood it to be. The way you might understand a word in a language you had never formally studied, because the context made it plain. He meant it as hello, or possibly as I see you, or possibly as I am acknowledging your presence without committing to any further communication. "Good afternoon," Susan said clearly. "My name is Susan Bell. I believe I have just purchased the 40 acres to the south of your boundary line, and I wanted to introduce myself before I started making any changes to the land, because I think it is courteous to let your neighbors know what you are planning." He stood there stunned. She watched it happen in real time, which was remarkable. The large man blinked. His jaw, which had been set in what she suspected was its habitual expression of settled taciturnity, came very slightly unset. He stared at her as though she had done something astonishing, and she supposed, to him, she had. She had answered his grunt with a full sentence. Multiple sentences, in fact, with information and a social philosophy embedded in them. She waited because she was a patient woman and also because she was curious what he would do. He closed his mouth. He opened it again. He said, in a voice that was lower than she had anticipated and considerably more deliberate, "Clement Bristol." It was clearly his name. He had given it to her the way a man might hand over a document he was not entirely sure was worth reading. "Mr. Bristol," she said, and extended her hand. He looked at her hand for a moment. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a man doing something he had not done in quite some time, he transferred his rifle to his left hand and shook hers with his right. His grip was controlled. She got the sense that he was being careful not to simply crush her fingers, which she appreciated. "You're not from here," he said. "No," she said. "Philadelphia, though I have been traveling for the better part of a month. What can you tell me about the soil on this side of the slope?" "I could not find any clear information in the correspondence I received." Another pause. He was clearly recalibrating something internal. "It drains well," he said. "Good clay content. You want to break the upper crust before first frost if you mean to do anything with it next spring." "That is very helpful," she said sincerely. "Thank you." He nodded once, looked at her for another moment with those unreadable gray-green eyes, and then stepped back into the aspens and was gone with no more sound than he had made arriving. Susan stood at the boundary stake for a moment longer, then walked back to her wagon. She was smiling, though she could not have said precisely why. She spent the first week in Coldwater Creek at the boarding house, run by a woman named Martha Good, who was 50 years old and had opinions about everything and shared them freely. Susan liked her immediately. Martha filled her in on the town's recent history over supper on the first evening, the silver mine that had opened 4 years ago and changed everything. The Ute communities further north, who the federal government was systematically pushing off their land in ways that Martha described as a flat-out shame, and most of the miners described in other terms. The cattle operations moving up from the south, the railroad that had not arrived yet but was coming according to everyone who stood to profit from it. "And what about the man on the upper slope?" Susan asked. "Clement Bristol." Martha set down her fork. "Now there is a question," she said. "He came to my boundary line the day I visited the property," Susan said. "He seemed functional." Martha actually laughed. "That is one word for it. Clement Bristol came to this valley 6 years ago from Wyoming, from what I know, which isn't much because he doesn't talk enough to have given anyone a full biography. He built his cabin himself. He traps, he hunts, he trades furs at the general store about once a month. He buys what he needs and he goes back up the mountain. He helped pull 2 men out of the creek during the spring flood last year, which is the only time I've seen him do anything you'd call social. He doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, doesn't cause trouble." "Is he married?" Susan asked, and then was briefly annoyed at herself for the order in which she was asking questions. Not to anything that shows, Martha said. He was engaged once, from what old Silas at the general store has put together from things Bristol let slip over the years. Woman back in Wyoming. She chose another man. That's all anyone knows. Susan nodded and returned to her supper. The following week she hired 2 men from town to help her clear the southwest corner of her property and begin laying the foundation for a small house. She had simple plans, 1 main room with a sleeping loft, a good fireplace, a proper kitchen area, and she supervised the work with the attentiveness of someone who had already made the mistake of assuming that clear plans would be followed without supervision. The men, brothers named Pete and Cal Dempsey, were competent and pleasant, and did not seem particularly troubled by taking direction from a woman, which she appreciated. Clement Bristol appeared at the tree line on the 3rd day of construction. He did not come closer. He simply stood there and watched for perhaps 20 minutes, then left. She did not make anything of it out loud, though she noticed it. Appeared again on the 5th day, and this time he came down to the site. The Dempsey brothers looked up, and Pete actually took a step back, which Susan found telling. "Bristol," Pete said. Bristol nodded. He looked at the foundation work and then at Susan. "You're setting the eastern wall wrong," he said. "The slope runs that direction," he pointed. "You want your drainage to pull away from the house, not toward it." Susan looked at the foundation, looked at the slope of the land, looked at Bristol. He was right. She could see it now that he said it. "How much would we need to shift it?" she asked. 14 inches, maybe 18, he said. "Can you show Mr. Dempsey?" He did, with a directness that was economical and effective, and Pete Dempsey did not argue with him. After that, Bristol started to leave, and Susan said, "Mr. Bristol, would you like some coffee? I have a fire going." He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. Then he turned. "All right," he said. They sat on a flat section of the cleared ground with tin cups of coffee and the sound of Pete and Cal working 20 yards away. Bristol sat the way big men sometimes sit, with a kind of careful stillness that suggested he was always aware of how much space he took up. "Have you been in Colorado long?" Susan asked. 6 years, he said. "Do you like it?" A pause. "It's where I am," he said, which she thought was not quite the same thing as an answer but was probably honest. "I'm going to plant spring wheat on the southwest portion and kitchen garden closer to the house," she said. "I've been looking at the water rights situation, and I believe the creek access on the northern edge should serve both properties." He looked at her steadily. "You looked at water rights?" "Of course," she said. "Water rights are the most important thing to establish before anything else out here. Mr. Fitch had the registry. Your access upstream is fully documented, and my access at the lower point is as well. There should be no conflict." Something moved across his face that she could not read. He drank his coffee. "You prepared," he said. "I try to," she said. "I have been planning this for nearly 2 years. I took what my husband left me and I thought very carefully about what I wanted to do with it. I did not want to depend on anyone else's decisions about my life." Another pause. "Your husband," he said, and it was as close to a question as she suspected he usually got. "He died of a fever 18 months ago," she said. "He was a good man. We were only married 3 years. But I had a choice between going back to my family's house and having my life managed for me, or finding a direction of my own, and I found that the second option was the only one I could actually live with." Bristol looked at the mountains for a moment. "I understand that," he said. "I thought you might," she said. He left shortly after, but the quality of his leaving was different from the first time. Less like a retreat, more like a departure that included the understanding that there would be a return. Over the following weeks, as October deepened and the cold became serious business, the house went up. The Dempsey brothers finished the frame and the walls, and Susan herself worked on the interior with a thoroughness that surprised Pete, who had not expected her to know how to handle a plane or a level, and pleased Cal, who simply appreciated competent company. Bristol came back 4 more times during the construction. Each time he came with something advice about the chimney draw, a length of seasoned wood that he had cut and left stacked at the edge of the tree line, information about the weather patterns that she should know before winter set in. Each time he stayed a little longer. Each time he spoke a few more words. Susan noticed that he was learning how to stay. She moved into the house on the 14th of October, 1879, which she wrote in the blank pages at the back of her journal as the beginning of the real part of her life, the part she was choosing rather than the part that had simply happened to her. The house was small and cold for the first week, until she got the chimney drawing properly, but it was hers in every timber and nail, and she went asleep on the first night with a satisfaction that sat in her chest like something warm. The following Saturday she drove to town to buy her winter stores, and in the general store she came face to face with Clement Bristol for the first time outside of her property. He was at the counter trading a bundle of furs for credit, speaking to old Silas in the clipped, minimal way that was apparently his standard register. He saw her come in and nodded. "Mrs. Bell," he said. "Mr. Bristol," she said. "I am glad to have run into you. I wanted to invite you to supper sometime this week if you are willing. A thank you for the advice and the wood." Silas behind the counter went very still in the way that people go still when they are trying to look like they are not listening. Bristol looked at her for a moment. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday is excellent," she said. 6 o'clock. He nodded and took his credit slip and left. Silas turned back to his counter and began straightening things that were already straight. "Don't say anything," Susan told him pleasantly. "Wasn't going to say a word," Silas said, and smiled at the counter. She made a proper supper on Thursday, roasted rabbit that Pete Dempsey had gotten for her, with dried beans and cornbread, and preserved peaches from the stock she had laid in for winter. She set the table with the 2 good plates she had brought from Philadelphia and the lamp in the center, and thought briefly about whether this was too much, and decided that she had never operated on the principle of too much when she was doing something she considered worthwhile. Bristol arrived at 6 o'clock exactly, which told her something about him. He ducked through her doorway with the automatic practiced motion of a man who had been ducking through doorways all his adult life. He was wearing a clean shirt. She noticed this and found it affecting in a way she had not anticipated. He stood in her front room and looked around with those careful gray-green eyes, taking stock of everything she had made of the space. The bookshelves she had built against the east wall and already half filled, the fire going in the hearth, the table set and the smell of food, the curtains she had hung in the 2 windows, yellow calico, because she had wanted color and yellow was the color that came to mind when she thought of the aspen trees. "You made this into something," he said. "I intend to keep making it into more," she said. "Sit down, please." He sat. He took up a great deal of the chair, and she had expected that, and she had also expected that sharing a small space with him would feel crowded. But it did not. He was careful with himself, with his elbows and his hands and the space he occupied, and she realized this was something he had learned, the way a large man learns in order to live alongside other people without constantly reminding them of his size. They ate and she asked him questions, not prying questions but genuine ones, and he answered them in the way he was apparently learning to answer her questions, which was with more than the strict minimum of information. He had come from Wyoming, as Martha had said. Before that, Ohio. He had learned trapping from a man in Wyoming who had learned it from a Shoshone trapper, and he said this with a directness that suggested he saw no reason to be anything other than honest about where knowledge came from. He had been in Colorado 6 years. "Did you choose this particular place deliberately?" she asked. He looked at his plate. "I needed somewhere," he said. "This was somewhere that nobody much was, and the mountains were big enough." "Big enough for what?" she asked. A long pause. "To feel like the rest of things were far enough away," he said. She understood that. She did not press it. "Do you read?" she asked. He looked up at her bookshelves. "Some," he said, which she suspected was modest. "You are welcome to borrow anything you like," she said. "I have a good many books and winter is long." He looked at the shelves for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I know winter is long," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been the very distant beginning of humor. "I meant for me," she said, and let herself smile, and he did something with the corner of his mouth that was not a full smile but was the infrastructure of one. After supper he sat by the fire and she made tea, and she read him the first pages of a novel she had been working through, a Dickens, which she had brought because she liked Dickens, and because she suspected that characters with grand emotions translated well to small isolated spaces. And he sat and listened with the focused stillness that she was coming to recognize as his mode of genuine engagement. He did not make a sound throughout, but when she stopped he said, "That's a good opening," with the considered certainty of someone who had thought about it and reached a conclusion. "It is one of the best I know," she agreed. He left at 9 o'clock with a copy of Dickens's Bleak House under his arm, having taken her offer of the loan with the seriousness of a man accepting something of real value. November came down hard. The snow arrived in the second week and stayed, piling against the walls of Susan's house until she had to dig a path to her woodpile every morning. She had been warned that Colorado Territory winters were serious, and she had prepared accordingly. But there was a difference between preparing for something and being inside it, and the first few weeks she was simply busy managing the reality of an isolated homestead in serious winter. Bristol checked on her. He did this without making ceremony of it, appearing at her door every 3 or 4 days to see that her wood supply was holding, and her roof was bearing the weight of the snow, and her water access to the creek was not completely frozen over. He fixed her shutter latch when it broke in a wind and relayed it with a piece of iron hardware he brought down from his cabin. He said little about these visits beyond what was functionally necessary, but he came consistently, and she came to expect him. She began to cook more than she needed for one person. It started as a practical thing. She was cooking a full pot of soup, and there was no reason for it to go to waste, and evolved into something that was easier to be honest with herself about as the weeks went on. She wanted his company. It was as simple as that. She enjoyed the large quiet of him, the way the room changed shape when he was in it, the way he listened to her with his whole attention, the way he was slowly, incrementally, learning to respond with more than the bare minimum, as though he was a door that was being carefully rehung on new hinges. One evening in mid-November she asked him directly what he had been reading. "I finished the Dickens," he said. He had the book with him, returned as promised. "I thought the ending was sentimental." "Which ending do you mean?" she asked. "There are several threads." "Jarndyce and the girl," he said. "Ada. You think he should have let her keep suffering?" "I think Dickens decides things for his characters when it suits him," Bristol said, with a specificity of literary opinion that genuinely delighted her. "He sets her up to make one choice and then changes her circumstances so she makes another. It's convenient." "That is a sophisticated observation," she said, and she meant it, not condescendingly but with real pleasure. He looked at her as though assessing whether she was mocking him. She held his gaze until he apparently concluded she was not. "What else do you have?" he asked, nodding at the shelves. She got up and brought him 4 options, and he chose the volume of Thoreau, which she thought was very fitting and told him so. And he read the first page standing up in her kitchen while she cleared the supper dishes and then sat down and kept reading. And she did not interrupt him, and they spent an entirely pleasant evening in each other's company with no more noise than the fire and the wind and the occasional turning of a page. This became a habit. Supper on Thursdays, which was the established arrangement, and then additional evenings that were not announced but that materialized because one of them found a reason to be at the other's door with something. A question about the fence line, a piece of information about a snowstorm coming from the north, a borrowed item returned, a book finished and wanting to discuss it. The reasons were real enough. The motivation underneath the reasons was something they were both, by November's end, aware of without having said anything about it. December arrived with a cold that was a different animal entirely from November's cold, And Susan's first indication that something was wrong came at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night when her chimney began drawing badly, and she woke to smoke filling the sleeping loft. She climbed down in a hurry, still half asleep, and opened the front door, and the problem revealed itself almost immediately: ice in the flue, which was something Bristol had warned her could happen and had told her how to clear. And in the confused darkness of the middle of the night, she could not fully remember his instructions. She stood in her open doorway in her nightgown and coat, her eyes watering from the smoke, and looked up the mountain because it was the direction she always looked when she needed something she did not have. She did not have to look for long. Bristol appeared out of the dark with a lantern in perhaps 20 minutes, because apparently he had seen smoke from her chimney in a pattern that told him something was wrong, and he did not grunt when he arrived. He said, "Chimney." And she said, "Yes, ice in the flue, I think." And he said, "I'll fix it." And he did, with the unhurried competence of a man who had dealt with this particular problem before, on a ladder in the cold at midnight. And she stood below holding the lantern for him and thinking that she had been alone in her life before, genuinely alone, the kind of alone where nobody comes when something goes wrong in the dark, and this was different. When he came down the ladder and the fire was drawing cleanly again and the smoke had cleared, she said, "Come inside and warm up before you walk back." He came inside and sat by the fire, and she made tea and sat across from him and looked at him directly in the firelight and said, "Thank you, Mr. Bristol, I mean that." He met her eyes. "I know you do," he said. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to tell me honestly if I am mistaken in my reading of things." He said nothing, which she had come to understand as an invitation to continue. "I think we have been spending time together because we want to," she said. "Not only because there is always a practical reason, though there usually is. I think you come to my door because you like being there, and I think I am glad when you do." The fire crackled. The wind moved against the windows. "You're not mistaken," Clement Bristol said. She let out a breath she had not been fully aware of holding. "All right," she said. "Good." He looked at her with a steadiness that was starting to feel, she thought, like the bravest thing she had ever been looked at with, because there was nothing hidden in it. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "Whatever this is, I haven't done it well before." "I don't imagine either of us has a perfect record," she said. "You had a good marriage," he said. "I had a kind marriage," she said carefully. "My husband was gentle and decent, and I cared for him deeply. But I was 20 years old when I married him, and I did not know yet what I was, and I think that he did not entirely know what he wanted, and we made each other happy enough without quite making each other whole. I do not say that to speak ill of him. He was a good man. I only say it so that you understand I am not comparing you to something I am grieving." He took this in with his characteristic careful attention. Then he said, with a slowness that told her each word was deliberate, "I would like to keep coming to your door." "I would like that very much," she said. He walked back up the mountain in the early hours of the morning, and she stood in her doorway watching the lantern light move through the trees until she could not see it any more. And then she went inside and built the fire up and sat with her journal and wrote for a long time about things she had not written about in years. Christmas came to Coldwater Creek with a fair amount of noise, because the town had a tradition of a community supper and dance in the Billings House saloon, the proprietor having pushed all the tables to the walls and laid in a fiddler from 2 towns over, and what was advertised as 5 gallons of punch. Martha Good told Susan about it and added that practically everyone came, even people who generally kept to themselves, and she said the last part while looking sideways at Susan in a way that was not subtle. Susan invited Bristol to accompany her. She did it on his Thursday visit, presenting it plainly as she presented everything, because she found it wasted a great deal of energy to be indirect about things. He looked at the middle distance for a moment. "A dance," he said. "Primarily a supper," she said. "There is also a dance, but nobody is required to participate in it." Another pause. "All right," he said. He arrived at her house on Christmas evening in a coat that was clean and pressed, and she had put on her best dress, which was dark green wool with cream at the collar, and she had put her hair up. And when she opened the door to him, he looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not name but which moved through her like heat. "You look well," he said. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." They drove to town in her wagon. The evening was clear and cold, and the stars were extraordinary in the way that Western stars were, vast and impersonal and beautiful. Bristol sat beside her on the wagon seat, and they talked about the stars, which led to a discussion of what he knew about navigation by them, which he had learned during a period in his early 20s when he had traveled extensively, and which he described with the kind of offhand thoroughness of someone who had stored up a great many things to say, and was slowly finding that there was someone worth saying them to. The Billings house was warm and loud, and full of people who all very distinctly noticed Clement Bristol when he walked in, and most of them were polite enough to manage their surprise without staring for too long. Martha Good came over immediately, which Susan had expected, and shook Bristol's hand with the cheerful directness that was her characteristic approach to all social situations, and she said she was glad to see him and she meant it, and Bristol said she had a good boarding house, which was high praise from him, and Martha accepted it as such. Supper was excellent. The fiddler was wonderful. People danced in the cleared space, and Susan clapped along, and Bristol sat beside her like a large, comfortable fact of nature and drank coffee, and watched the room with what she had come to recognize as his engaged version of his neutral expression, which meant he was interested in things even when his face was not particularly advertising it. When a waltz started, she looked at him. "I cannot promise to be graceful," he said, before she could ask. "Neither can I," she said, which was a mild lie because she danced quite well, but she thought it would help. He stood and offered his hand, and they moved to the cleared floor, and he placed his large hand carefully at her waist, and held her other hand with the same deliberate care he brought to everything physical, and they waltzed. And he was not graceful, but he was steady, and she did not need graceful. She needed steady. And she looked up at him while they moved, and he was looking down at her with that same direct, honest gaze, and the room was warm and full of music and light, and she thought she had made the right choice. Coming west, all of it, the whole chain of decisions that had led to this exact moment. "You are doing quite well," she told him. "You are being generous," he said, but he was almost smiling. "I am being accurate," she said, and he did smile then, really and fully, and she had not seen that before, and it changed his face entirely, opened something in it, and she felt the knowledge of it settle into her like a true thing she would not forget. The new year came in with a blizzard that kept Susan in her house for 4 days, and on the second day Bristol appeared at her door with a haunch of venison and the calm demeanor of someone who found 4 feet of snow unremarkable. "You should not have walked through this," she told him. "I have snowshoes," he said, indicating the objects on his feet, which she had not noticed because she was looking at him. She let him in, and they spent the afternoon and the evening inside while the storm did its work, and this was different from their other evenings because there was no pretense of a reason for the visit, no practical errand wrapped around the real motivation, just 2 people sitting by a fire with nowhere else to be, and the ease of it was something she wanted to keep. She was at the kitchen area slicing bread when he said her name, not Mrs. Bell, her name, Susan. She turned. He was sitting in the chair by the fire, the Thoreau in his hands, and he was looking at her. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been here 6 years," he said, "and in 6 years I built a good life. I mean that. I built something that worked and was mine and that I didn't have to explain to anyone, and I thought that was enough." A pause. He put the book down. "I didn't know what enough was until I had something better to measure it against." The bread knife was still in her hand. She set it down on the board. "You are better than my enough," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm not good at saying things, and I know that, but I want you to know that." She crossed the small room and stood in front of him, and he looked up at her from the chair with an expression that was the bravest thing she had ever seen on a human face, because it was completely undefended, no walls, no distance, nothing held back. "Clement," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am going to tell you something too," she said. "I came here to build a life for myself that did not depend on anyone else. I came with plans and intentions and a great deal of confidence in my own capability. And I have found every single thing I expected to find, and I have also found you, which I did not expect at all. And you have made everything more than I planned for." He reached up and took her hand in both of his, which was how she knew he was someone who understood how to hold things carefully. "I am asking if I can court you properly," he said. "In whatever way that means to you, I don't want to assume things." "You may absolutely court me properly," she said. "Though I should tell you that in my understanding of courtship, a great deal of it has already occurred." "I thought that might be the case," he said, and the smile came back. Spring arrived with a drama that surprised her. The melt was sudden, and the creek ran high, and the ground beneath the snow revealed itself muddy and dark and vivid, like something waking up angry and full of energy. Susan started her kitchen garden the first week of March and began breaking ground on the southwest portion for the wheat, which Bristol helped her with on the days he was not running his trap lines, plowing with the borrowed horse and the single-share plow she had traded a month's credit at the general store for. They worked well together. She had noticed this in smaller ways all winter, the way they moved around each other's spaces and tasks without collision, the way they communicated with economical efficiency when there was work to be done, the way they could also simply exist in the same area doing different things with complete comfort. She thought of these as evidence of something, the way a good stand of wheat in June is evidence of what the soil was doing in March. He kissed her for the first time in April. They were walking the northern boundary of her property where the creek was still running quick and brown with snowmelt, and she had been talking about her plans for extending the kitchen garden north, and she stopped to look at a section of the bank. And when she turned back, he was very close and looking at her with an expression that had everything in it, and she said, "Oh, go ahead then," which was possibly not the most romantic thing anyone had ever said. And he made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh, and then he kissed her, carefully and completely, and it was the kind of kiss that felt like an answer to a question that had been standing in the room for months. "Finally," she said when it was done. "You could have said something earlier," he said. "So could you," she pointed out. "I was working up to it," he said, with the dignity of a man who had been working up to things his entire life and knew the value of the process. "Duly noted," she said, and kissed him back, which settled the matter. April also brought something less pleasant to Coldwater Creek, in the form of a man named Gerald Voss, who arrived from Denver with a letter of authorization from a land speculator, and a claim that 200 acres of the eastern slope, including Susan's 40, had been incorrectly transferred through the proxy arrangement with Fitch, and were actually held in the name of the Denver Land Company. Susan first heard about this from Mr. Fitch himself, who came to her door looking extremely embarrassed and explained the situation with a lot of qualifications and very little clarity. She thanked him for telling her, and then she got on her horse and rode to town to find Gerald Voss before she did anything else. Voss was in the land office. He was a thin, pale man in a good suit who was clearly accustomed to arriving in places and having things go his way. He had documents. She asked to see them. She read them carefully and then she said, "These show a transfer of 200 acres made in 1876, before Mr. Fitch recorded my purchase in 1879. But they do not show payment." Voss looked at her with the mild surprise of a man who had not expected her to read documents carefully. "Payment was made in a private arrangement," he said. "What was the nature of the arrangement?" "That is confidential," he said. "Then it is also unverifiable," she said. "And my deed, which was properly recorded with the Territorial Land Office in Denver, is a public document. I will need to travel to Denver to confirm my recording, but I am confident in my position." She rode back home. Bristol was at her fence line, having heard she had ridden out fast and worked out roughly why. He listened to her account of the conversation with Voss with the focused attention he brought to problems, and then he said, "He's done this before." "What do you mean?" "There was a man in Wyoming," Bristol said carefully. "Different name, same approach. Company sends a man with bad paperwork and makes enough noise that settlers without resources to fight just leave. They count on it." Susan pressed her lips together. "He has underestimated the situation," she said. "Yes," Bristol said with complete confidence. "He has." She wrote 3 letters that evening, to the Territorial Land Office in Denver, to a lawyer she had retained correspondence with in Philadelphia who had experience with land law, and to the county recorder whose office was in Colorado Springs. She sent them with the morning stage. While she waited for responses, she continued her spring work, because the wheat did not care about Gerald Voss and the garden did not care about Gerald Voss, and she refused to allow Gerald Voss to occupy more of her energy than the letters required. Bristol came every day during this period, not hovering but present, and she found this exactly right. She did not need protection, she needed steadiness, and he was the steadiest thing she had found. Voss came to her property on a Wednesday in late April with 2 men on horses, riding up the wagon track with the obvious intention of presenting authority through numbers. Susan was in her kitchen garden. She stood up when she heard them and brushed the dirt from her hands and waited. Voss dismounted. "Mrs. Bell," he said, with a smile that was entirely form and no content, "I have come to discuss a reasonable settlement." "Good morning," she said. "I have heard from the Territorial Land Office in Denver that my deed is properly recorded and that no competing claim for this specific 40 acres is on file with them. I have also heard from my lawyer in Philadelphia, who has corresponded with a colleague in Denver who practices land law, that the document you showed me last week contains a land description that does not match this parcel. Would you like me to show you the correspondence?" Voss's pleasant expression went through several revisions. "That cannot be right," he said. "I can show you the letters," she said. "This is not finished," he said, and there was something less pleasant in his voice now. "I believe it is," said Clement Bristol. He had come around the side of the house from where he had, she suspected, been watching from the tree line. He was carrying his rifle in the same casual way he always carried it, but his size in that moment was functioning as a piece of information independent of any other communication, and the 2 men on their horses both became very still. Voss looked at Bristol for a long moment. Then he looked back at Susan. "Good day, Mrs. Bell," he said, and mounted his horse and left. She turned to Bristol. "I had that handled," she said. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to be there." She looked at him for a moment and decided she was not going to argue with that particular motivation. "Thank you," she said. Voss departed Coldwater Creek within the week, and Susan received confirmation in May from the Denver Land Office that her deed was valid and no competing claim existed. She celebrated this by making a very good supper and inviting Martha Good, who brought the town doctor, a cheerful man named Dr. Emil Parsons, and the Dempsey brothers, and Bristol sat at her table surrounded by people for the first time in she did not know how long, and he was quiet but he was present. And at the end of the evening, when everyone had gone, he helped her clear the table and wash the dishes, which is something that people only do when they consider a space partly their own. May became June, and the wheat came up, and the kitchen garden was extraordinary, and the creek ran clear and cold in its right-shaped channel, and Susan Bell stood on her property one morning in early June, and looked at everything she had made, and felt a completeness that she had been working toward without knowing exactly what it would feel like when she arrived. Bristol was beside her, having come down the mountain with the morning because he had taken to doing that more days than not. He looked at the wheat and then at her. "Good stand," he said. "Better than I hoped," she said. "You prepared well," he said. "I had good advice," she said, and looked at him sideways, and he looked back at her with those gray-green eyes that she had long since concluded were not unreadable. She had just needed to learn the language. "Susan," he said. Yes, she said. He turned to face her fully, the mountains behind him and the morning light on his face, and she thought she had never seen anything that looked more like the actual West than this man, large and real and made of the same material as the landscape, granite and sky. I would like to marry you, he said. If you'll have me. I know you came here to have your own life and your own land, and I am not asking you to give those things up. I am asking if you want to have them alongside having me. She had been waiting, she realized, for some version of this. She had been waiting for it the way you wait for something you are sure is coming but cannot be certain of the exact shape. Yes, she said. Absolutely yes, with a very clear understanding that my land is mine and yours is yours, and we are two separate people who have chosen each other. That is exactly what I want, he said. Then we are agreed, she said, and put her hand up to his face the way she had been wanting to do for quite some time, and he closed his eyes briefly and turned his face into her palm like something seeking warmth. They were married in July in the little Coldwater Creek church, which had turned out to be under construction rather than falling apart, and was now fully functional and quite pleasant inside. Martha Good cried at the ceremony in a way that she would have denied if confronted. The Dempsey brothers were there, and old Silas from the general store, and Dr. Parsons, and a selection of townsfolk who had in the month since Susan's arrival formed the opinion that she was an asset to the community, and a smaller selection who had formed the opinion that Clement Bristol marrying anyone at all was so remarkable as to require witnessing in person. Bristol wore a suit that he had ordered from Colorado Springs, and he stood at the front of the church with an expression of focused determination that Susan found perfectly him, as though he had decided on this course with the full weight of his judgment and was committed to it past the point of all possible doubt. When the minister said he could kiss his bride, he did so with the careful deliberateness of everything he did, and there was a small collective sound from the assembled guests that was half laughter and entirely warmth. You are now somewhat legally obligated to talk to me every day, she told him quietly. I had already decided that, he said. They walked out of the church into the July heat, and the assembled guests threw rice and cheered, and Bristol stood in the middle of it looking very large and slightly overwhelmed, and Susan put her hand through his arm and he looked down at her, and whatever he felt in that moment was entirely on his face because she had taught him, without meaning to leave his face available, and it was the same as everything else she had found in the West, more than she had planned for, richer and bigger and more real. The summer was generous. The wheat harvest in August was good, better than good, and Susan and Bristol worked it together with hired help from two of the Dempsey brothers' younger cousins, cutting and binding and stacking until the southwest field was clean and the grain was laid in. The kitchen garden produced abundantly squash and beans and tomatoes and potatoes, and a great quantity of dried herbs that hung in bunches from the ceiling of the root cellar she had dug the previous fall. Bristol's cabin on the upper slope became more of a storage and work space than a home. He moved his daily life into her house without making a production of it, bringing things down in loads that accumulated over the weeks. His tools, his books, his trapping equipment, his carefully maintained gun stores, the small collection of objects that told a story of a life lived in deliberate simplicity. He built a proper workroom attached to the east side of the house in August, a good solid addition with a wood stove for winter, where he could work his furs and maintain his equipment, and also, increasingly, where he sat and read in the evenings when Susan was writing in her journal or corresponding with her lawyer, or doing the account books for the farm. They had their first significant argument in September. It was about whether to take on a second parcel of land that had come available on the creek's south bank, which Susan wanted to do, and Bristol thought was overextending their resources in year one. The argument was real and substantive, and they both said their positions with heat and clarity, and then they were quiet for a while on opposite sides of the kitchen, and then Bristol said, "You might be right about the creek access," and Susan said, You are right that we should not overextend. And they arrived at a compromise that was neither of their original positions and was better than both. That evening she sat beside him on the front step in the cooling September air and said, "For the record, I think our ability to argue with each other and then not be destroyed by it is a very good sign." "Agreed," he said. "I was a little worried you might shut down," she said. "I thought about it," he said honestly. "It's what I usually do, but you wouldn't have let me." "No," she agreed. "I would not have." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they sat and watched the mountains in the evening light, which were the same mountains they had always been, enormous and permanent and indifferent to human arrangements, which made the human arrangements, she thought, all the more worth attending to. September also brought a letter from Susan's younger sister, Clara, in Philadelphia. The letter was several pages and full of news about the family and the city, and also contained, near the end, a careful series of sentences that were clearly the point of the letter, about how their mother was in declining health and whether Susan had considered returning to Philadelphia or having the family come to her. Susan read this letter twice and then put it down and thought for a long time. Bristol came in from the workroom and saw her face. "What is it?" he said. She showed him the letter. He read it, which took him longer than it took her because he read with care, going over sentences twice when he wanted to be sure of them. "Your mother," he said. "Yes. Can she travel?" "Clara doesn't say she can't," Susan said. "She says she is declining, which could mean many things. Write back and ask clearly," he said, "and invite them to come if she is able. Spring would be better for travel." "You would not mind," she said. He looked at her. "They're your family," he said. "That's not a thing I would mind." She wrote back that evening, and the correspondence that followed through the autumn established that Susan's mother, while in genuinely uncertain health, was well enough to travel in the spring, and that Clara was eager to see the West, and the plan was made. October and November settled over the valley and the Bristol homestead. She had started thinking of it as that, the Bristol homestead, knowing that it was also still her homestead, and that these things were not in conflict with the same deep winter architecture as the year before. But this year it was different because she was not alone in it. Bristol was a good winter companion in the specific ways that matter. He was not restless or irritable when confined. He was warm in the literal sense because he was an enormous person with good circulation. He cooked competently if simply when she was occupied with other things, and he continued to be willing to sit in the same room with a book in the evenings with a contentment that she found deeply compatible with her own nature. They read aloud to each other more and more as the winter deepened. She would read and he would listen, or he would read. He had a reading voice that surprised everyone who heard it because it was low and deliberate and perfectly paced, and she would sit with her mending or her journal and listen, and the evenings folded away like this, one after another, and they were good. She knew she was pregnant by the end of December, confirmed in her own understanding by early January, and confirmed by Dr. Parsons with professional certainty in mid-January. She told Bristol on a Tuesday evening after supper, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked up at her and she saw something cross his face that she had not seen before, that she did not have a name for exactly, something that combined wonder and fear and a kind of immense gratitude in proportions that moved in her like music. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. He came around the table and crouched in front of her chair and took both her hands in both of his and held them, and she looked at his face and saw all of it, everything that he had carried inside that large, careful body for 30 years, and she thought that, whatever happened in her life from this point forward, this moment was one she would return to in her memory for the rest of it. "I am going to do this well," he said, quietly and with absolute intention. "I know," she said. "We both are." The winter finished itself out and spring came again, and with spring came Susan's sister Clara, arriving on the westbound stage from Colorado Springs with their mother, Eleanor Bell, who was 63 years old and frail in a way that showed in her frame but not in her eyes, which were sharp and dark, and took in everything with the same assessment that Susan had apparently inherited. Clara was 26 and had Susan's directness without Susan's patience, which made her someone who arrived at conclusions faster and occasionally at the wrong ones. But she was warm and funny, and she and Susan fell back into each other's company with the ease of people who have always understood each other. Alina Bell took one look at Clement Bristol in the yard when they arrived and said, "Good Lord, he is large." And Bristol, who had been standing there looking somewhat as though he had prepared himself for a formal inspection, said, "Yes, ma'am," and Alina said, "Come here and let me look at you." And he went, and she looked up at him from her considerable disadvantage of height and said, "You're treating my daughter well." "I am doing my best," he said. "Are you succeeding?" she said. Bristol looked at Susan. Susan nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good," Alina said, and patted his arm, which she could barely reach. "Now help me down from this road, it's uneven." He did, with extraordinary care, and Susan watched her mother smile at the gentleness of his large hands, and she thought, "This is exactly right." Clara fell somewhat in love with the West immediately and comprehensively. She wanted to ride, and she learned, borrowing a horse from the livery with Pete Dempsey's cheerful instruction. She went with Susan to see the wheat fields and the kitchen garden and the creek and the mountains, and kept saying things like "remarkable," and "I had no idea it was like this," and Susan felt a satisfaction in showing her the life she had built. Alina Bell's health was genuinely uncertain, but she was not as fragile as Clara's letter had suggested. She sat on the front step in the May sun and drank tea and watched the mountains and said to Susan one afternoon, "You made the right choice. I was not certain of it when you left, but you made the right choice." "I know," Susan said. "He is a very unusual man," Alina said, meaning Bristol. "Yes," Susan agreed. "The quiet ones are the kind ones," Alina said, with the authority of someone who had studied human nature for 6 decades. "The loud ones are performing. The quiet ones are actually there." Susan looked at her mother with genuine appreciation. "I came to the same conclusion," she said. The baby was born in August, a healthy boy with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's expression of permanent assessment. They named him William John Bristol, William for Susan's father and John for no one in particular, but because Bristol said it was a name that stood on its own without needing anything from the world, which Susan thought was exactly the kind of reason to name a person something. The birth was attended by Dr. Parsons and Martha Good, who turned out to have considerable practical experience with births, and by Clara, who held Susan's hand with fierce concentration, and by Bristol, who was present for the whole of it because Susan had told him clearly that she wanted him there, and he had said with equal clarity that there was nowhere else he would be. When the boy was placed in his arms for the first time, Bristol stood in the middle of the room with this very small new person held against his chest in those big hands and looked down at him with an expression that was completely open, completely undefended, the most entirely present she had ever seen him, which was saying a significant thing. "Hello," he said to the baby, in that low, deliberate voice. William looked up at him with the unfocused attention of a newborn and made a small sound. "He grunted at you," Clara said with delight. "He did," Bristol said, and Susan, who was exhausted and entirely spent, and also the happiest she had ever been in her life, laughed so hard she had to close her eyes. Alina Bell stayed through September and then took the stage back to Philadelphia with Clara, who extracted promises from Susan that she would write every week and promises from Bristol that he would keep Susan safe, which he gave seriously, and she found both touching and slightly exasperating in the way that being protected can be both. On the morning the stage left, Alina held Susan's face in both hands and looked at her and did not say anything for a moment, just looked. "You are well," Alina said. It was not a question. "I am very well," Susan said. "I see that," Alina said, and kissed her forehead the way she had done since Susan was small. And then she let the driver help her up into the stage, and Susan watched it pull away down the main street, and felt the particular poignancy of watching family leave when you know that the life you have now is irrevocably here, and not there, and that this is the right thing even when it pulls. Bristol's hand found hers and held it, and they stood in the street together until the stage was gone. "She liked you," Susan told him. "More than I expected," he said. "She is a good judge of character," Susan said. "Then I am glad she arrived at a favorable conclusion," he said, and she heard the dry current of humor in it, the thing she had slowly come to hear more and more as the months had opened him, and she squeezed his hand and they walked back to the wagon. The second year was harder and better both. The wheat was larger and the kitchen garden was expanded, and they hired a regular hand named Tom Alvarez, who was 18 and competent and learned things quickly, and treated Susan with the respectful directness. She appreciated and learned within the first 2 weeks that Bristol's silences were a feature and not a flaw. Tom took the spare room in the workroom addition for the summer and fall months, and was such a genuinely good presence on the place that Susan started paying him more than they had initially agreed, which he tried to argue with, and she declined to argue back about. Tom was also the first person who tried to get Bristol to talk about his past in any comprehensive way, not from nosiness but from the genuine interest of a young man who admired the older one. And Bristol, to Susan's private surprise, responded to this with somewhat more openness than he usually managed. She overheard pieces of it from the kitchen window over several weeks. Wyoming, the early years of trapping, a period of working on cattle drives that he had clearly found alienating in ways he described with minimal words that carried considerable weight. The woman he had been engaged to, whose name was Ruth, who had chosen a merchant from Laramie, and who he said, with a directness that told her he had made his peace with it, had probably made the right choice for herself. She did not let him know she had heard any of it, but she was glad he was telling it to someone, because the telling of a thing is part of the setting down of it, and she wanted him to be able to set it down. William at 6 months was a person with strong opinions and a carrying voice, and Bristol discovered that he was good with babies in the specific way that very steady people often are: unflappable, warm, consistent, present. He could calm William in the middle of the night with a patience that even Susan, who loved her son completely, could not always match at 2 in the morning, and he took this duty seriously, rising when the baby woke without being asked, without counting who had done it last, without treating it as something external to himself. She watched him walking the dark cabin with their son against his chest one February night, when she had woken at the baby's cry and then lain still for a moment and heard Bristol already moving, and she looked at them both, the enormous careful man and the small insistent child, and thought that this was what she had needed to see, not to be certain because she had been certain for some time, but to see it with all its completeness, to have the image of it to keep. Spring of 1880, one brought the railroad to within 30 miles of Coldwater Creek, which changed the character of the town faster than anything Susan had seen in her time there. New people arrived, new businesses, new pressures on land and water, and the established social arrangements of the community. The silver mine expanded its operations and brought in labor from the South, Mexican workers who were paid substantially less than the white workers, and housed in conditions that were worse. And Susan wrote about this in several letters to the territorial newspaper that were printed under the initials SB, and caused enough stir that people in town speculated about who had written them, and Martha Good knew, and did not say. Bristol read the letters when they were published, and handed the newspaper back to her and said, "Good. Some people will not like them," she said. "That's not a reason not to write them," he said. "No," she agreed. There was a conversation that happened in the fall of 1881 with a man named Douglas Carter, who had bought the land adjacent to Bristol's upper trapline and was allowing his cattle to cross boundaries that were clearly marked. Bristol handled the first conversation with Carter alone, as it was his trapline, and came back from it looking as though he had exercised considerable restraint. The second conversation he had with Carter, Susan came along, and she watched the two men talk with the attentiveness of someone who was gathering information, and Carter's manner toward Bristol shifted when Susan spoke, not because she said anything threatening, but because she was precise and specific and clearly knew the law better than Carter expected, and precision is sometimes its own form of power. Carter kept his cattle on his side of the line after that. Tom Alvarez, who had heard the whole story, shook his head with a kind of appreciative wonder and said, "Mrs. Bristol, you are something else entirely." "Thank you, Tom," she said. The fall harvest of 1881 was the best they had had. The wheat filled the storage properly, and the kitchen garden's output exceeded what they could use and preserve, and Susan sold the excess at the general store and at the Saturday market that had started up on Main Street in the boom of new arrivals. Silas told her she should think about expanding, and she was already thinking about it. She told Bristol that night that she thought they should put in a second wheat field on the south parcel that she had looked at the previous year and decided against. He considered this for the same careful length of time he brought to everything. "The water situation is better now," he said, meaning the creek access had been fully negotiated and was not in question. "The equipment, we can afford a better plow this year," she said. "And Tom," he agreed, because Tom's value to the operation was now simply an established fact. "Then I think we do it," he said. "Yes," she said. They were sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp lit between them and William asleep in his cradle near the fire, and she looked at her husband across the table, her husband, still a remarkable pair of words even 2 years on, and thought about how this was the image of what she had wanted when she left Philadelphia, this exact thing. The warm room and the land that was hers and the life she had chosen, and the man across the table who was the part she had not planned for and was glad every day to have found. "Clement," she said. He looked up from the papers in front of him, the land maps they had been studying. "I am very glad you came to my boundary line that first day," she said. He held her gaze with all the directness that was his natural mode now, with her, the openness he had learned to leave available because she had taught him that it was safe to do so. "I am very glad you were standing there to come to," he said. She reached across the table and he took her hand, and they sat like that for a moment in the quiet of the well-made house, the fire going, the baby breathing softly in his cradle, the mountains outside enormous and permanent and indifferent, making all the small, warm human arrangements inside all the more worth the making. William learned to walk in March of 1882, determined and emphatic about it in the way he was determined and emphatic about most things, having apparently combined the stubbornness of both parents into a single small, forceful person. Bristol spent a Saturday morning following him around the yard, with the focused patience of a man who understood that the best way to help something learn its own capabilities was to stay close enough to catch it when it fell without staying so close it couldn't try. Susan watched from the front step with her tea, and thought that she had been right about him from that first conversation at the boundary line. Not right about every specific. She could not have told you then that he would walk a baby around a yard in the March mud with this quality of attention, but right about the essential thing, which was that underneath all that silence and all that distance that he had built into himself was a person of uncommon depth. And depth, she had always believed, was the only thing worth looking for in another human being. He looked up from where he was crouching near William and caught her watching him and raised an eyebrow. "Just looking," she said. "At what?" he said. "At what I have," she said simply. He held her gaze for a moment, and then William pitched forward into his hands, and the moment broke into laughter and the morning went on. By the summer of 1882, Coldwater Creek had grown substantially, with a proper schoolhouse and a post office and a second general store and a newspaper, and Susan had contributed to the establishment of all of these in various ways, the school most directly, having helped organize the parents' committee that lobbied the county for funding, and having donated both money and labor to the building. The teacher who came was a young woman from Ohio named Dorothea Marsh. who was 22 and capable, and who Tom Alvarez began finding reasons to visit the schoolhouse far more often than his general literacy requirements warranted, which Susan and Bristol discussed privately with considerable amusement. Tom and Dorothea were married the following spring, and Susan stood at the church beside Bristol with William, who was now 2 years old and very loud about his opinions regarding being dressed in his good clothes, and thought about the distance between that first winter and this present moment, the accumulation of events and seasons and choices that had built this particular life in this particular place. The Bristol homestead at the end of 1882 was 40 acres of Susan's original land plus the south parcel she had bought in the second year, 2 wheat fields, a substantial kitchen garden, a proper root cellar and smokehouse, a good barn that Bristol had built with Tom's help in the second summer, and the house itself, which Susan had expanded twice, and which now had a proper bedroom for them, and a small room for William and the workroom addition, and a front room large enough to receive guests comfortably. The bookshelves had expanded to 2 full walls of the front room, and were the source of consistent comment from visitors, most of which Bristol deflected with a precision that amused her. "My wife reads," as though reading were a single thing rather than the ongoing project it clearly was for both of them. She was pregnant again by December of 1882. She told Bristol in the same way she had told him the first time, sitting across from him at the kitchen table after supper, and he had the same stillness, and then the same expression that she had kept in her memory from the first time, wonder and gratitude and the fear that came from caring about something so much that the possibility of its absence was itself alarming. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. "Good," he said, with a quietness that was everything. This baby came in August of 1883, another August delivery, which Dr. Parsons noted with cheerful scientific interest. She was a girl, darker than William, with Bristol's dark hair and Susan's eyes, and they named her Eleanor Jane Bristol, Eleanor for Susan's mother and Jane, because it was a name that stood by itself the same way John did, strong and sufficient. Clara came west for the birth, having written 3 months earlier to say that she had been corresponding with a man in Denver and would be coming to Colorado regardless, and she arrived 2 weeks before the baby came and stayed 2 months after, which was almost enough time for all of the things she had to say about everything. Susan's mother had died the previous November, which they had known was coming, but which was still a loss of a particular kind, the kind that changes the shape of the family permanently, and Clara's presence was both a comfort and a reminder, the way having family close always is. Bristol and Clara had arrived at an understanding in the previous visit that had solidified into something that Susan would have called genuine fondness. Clara was the only person outside of Susan who could make Bristol laugh out loud, partly because she was genuinely funny and partly because she had absolutely no fear of him whatsoever, which he apparently found refreshing. "You are going to have an enormous family," Clara said one September afternoon, holding Eleanor while William tried to show her a rock he had found, which he was doing by holding it 3 inches from her face. "I would not mind that," Susan said. "Bristol," Clara said with a glance toward where Bristol was splitting wood in the yard. "Ask him," Susan said. Clara carried the baby outside and said, "Clement, would you mind an enormous family?" Bristol, who had paused with the axe, considered this with the seriousness he brought to direct questions. "No," he said. "How many?" Clara pressed. "As many as Susan wants," he said, and went back to splitting wood. Clara came back inside with the baby looking extremely pleased with this answer. "That man," she said. "I know," Susan said. Clara returned to Denver in October and was married the following spring to the man from the letters, a civil engineer named Harmon Reed, who was thoughtful and steady in ways that Susan recognized as Clara's compliment, the same way she thought of herself and Bristol as each other's complement, not identical, not frictionless, but genuinely fitted. Tom and Dorothea Alvarez had their first child in the summer of 1884, a boy they named James, and their small homestead on the edge of town was becoming a proper place. Bristol and Tom maintained the friendship that had started as an employer-employee arrangement and had grown into something that was more honest than that. Two men who worked well together and respected each other's skills and were comfortable in each other's company, which Bristol did not have many of, and Tom, who was warm and outward by nature, seemed to understand was a rare offering and treated accordingly. Susan's second daughter came in the winter of 1885, a February baby in a snowstorm that made even Bristol look slightly anxious as he stood at the bedroom door waiting for Dr. Parsons' announcement. The baby was Margaret Ruth Bristol. The Ruth was for Bristol's former fiancé, which was Susan's idea and which made Bristol go very still for a moment, and then say thank you in a voice that was quieter than usual. And she was healthy and dark-eyed and furious about the world from the first moment, which suggested she was going to be a handful of the most wonderful kind. By 1886, the Bristol homestead was known throughout the county as one of the most productive wheat operations in the valley, and Susan had expanded into selling preserved goods commercially through the railroad connection that had finally come within 20 miles of Coldwater Creek. She was not wealthy, but she was solvent in a way that was entirely her own construction, and this continued to be the thing about her life that satisfied her most deeply, not out of pride exactly, but out of the knowledge that she had done what she said she was going to do. Bristol's trapline had reduced over the years, not because the mountains were less good for it, but because the homestead had grown to the point where his time was better spent differently. He still went up the mountain for 2 or 3 days at a stretch in the fall and winter, not purely for trapping now, but because he needed, periodically, the large silence of the upper elevation, the distance from the noise of daily life, and Susan understood this the way she understood everything essential about him, not as a withdrawal from her, but as a part of what he was. And what he was included a man who had learned to live in enormous quiet, and still carried that in him, the way you carry the first language you learned even when you are speaking a second one fluently. He always came back from the mountain with his specific quality of renewed presence, the particular attentiveness of someone who has spent time in his own company and is genuinely glad to return to another's. He would come through the door and find her wherever she was and stand near her without drama, just near, the way he had been doing since the beginning, and she would say something ordinary about supper or the children or the state of the South Field, and he would respond with something equally ordinary, and the dailiness of it was the most extraordinary thing she had ever been given. William started school in the fall of 1885 and took to reading with an enthusiasm that surprised no one given his household. He would come home from school with books and sit in the corner of the front room with the focused absorption of his father and read, until someone made him come to the table, and Bristol would sit in his chair and read simultaneously, and Susan would look at the two of them, the large man and the small boy with the same gray-green eyes and the same way of going completely still when something interested them, and feel a happiness so uncomplicated it almost made her laugh. Alina showed signs of being a different kind of intelligence, quick and social and interested in people over books, though she would sit with a picture book willingly enough. Margaret, when she was old enough to show signs, was going to be, Susan suspected, interested in everything simultaneously and loudly, which was going to keep them all alert. 1987, and the Colorado Territory was changing around them with a speed that was sometimes disorienting. Statehood had come in 1876, before Susan arrived, and the decade since had seen the state fill in with people, and with the institutions people build, railroads and courts and newspapers and schools, and the slow, complicated process of deciding what kind of place it was going to be. The question of the Ute people, displaced and dispossessed in ways that had been brutal and were still ongoing, was something that Susan wrote about, and Bristol was grimly factual about when asked. And they raised their children knowing that the land they had built their lives on had a history longer than their own, and that this history deserved acknowledgement even when the acknowledgement was uncomfortable. Tom Alvarez, whose family had been in New Mexico territory for 3 generations, spoke to this history with a specificity that educated all of them. And the conversations around the Bristol supper table on evenings when Tom and Dorothea and their children came for supper were, Martha Good said once, the most interesting in the county, which was high praise from Martha, who had made it her business to attend a great many suppers in her time. Martha herself had become a kind of fixed star in the constellation of their life, the woman who had taken Susan in on the first night, and who had been present for and informed about nearly everything since. She was now in her mid-60s and had no intention of slowing down, and she and Bristol had arrived, over the years, at a friendship of a specific kind. She talked, and he listened, and occasionally said something that was so precisely right that she would point at him and say, "That, exactly that," as though he had finally and correctly translated something she had been saying for years. Susan turned 38 in the summer of 1893, which she marked by standing in the north field at sunrise and counting the years since she had dismounted at the Coldwater Creek livery with her saddlebag on her shoulder and the mountains enormous behind the town. And she counted 14 years, which was more years than she had been alive before she understood what she wanted from a life. Bristol found her in the field and stood beside her with a cup of coffee, which he had brought because he knew where she was and why, in the way he knew most things about her now, with the accumulated intelligence of a man who had paid attention for a long time to someone he loved. 14 years, she said. Good 14 years, he said. The best kind, she said. He handed her the coffee and she took it, and they stood in the field with the morning coming up over the mountains, and Coldwater Creek below them was waking up with its noise and its progress and its complications, and their children were in the house beginning the day's arguments about whose turn it was to do what, and Tom would be at the barn within the hour, and there was wheat to bring in before the weather changed. "What do you want?" he said, "for the next 14. She considered it seriously because he had asked seriously, and she had never in her life given Bristol anything less than her serious consideration. "More of this," she said. "More of exactly this, with variations." "Variations," he said. "Surprises," she said. "I want to be surprised by things I didn't plan for. That has always been the best part." He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that she had spent 14 years reading and that still, occasionally, showed her something new. "I can do that," he said. "You already have," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders in the way that was his way, solid and certain, and she leaned into the warm, large bulk of him, which was still, after all this time, the most comfortable place she knew. The mountains were exactly where they had always been, white at the tops and enormous and enduring, and the creek ran clean in its channel, and the wheat moved in the morning wind, and the life she had built, their life, made of 2 people who had stood at a boundary line and chosen each other without quite knowing they were choosing, was all around her in every direction, solid and real and full of the kind of beauty that does not come pre-planned, but accrues, season by season, year by year. The way good soil builds itself from everything that falls into it and is tended and turned and given time. She thought about that first afternoon, the grunt. The full sentence she had given him in return, the information and the social philosophy and the intention, and the way he had stood there stunned by the sheer fact of being addressed as a full person by someone who had just met him and expected him to be one. She thought she had known, even then, that there was something worth knowing here. She had not known what shape it would take. She had not known she would end up with this particular man, and this particular mountain, and these particular children with their gray-green eyes and their loud opinions and their borrowed books. She had not known that the life she was planning, the independent, self-determined life, would turn out to be largest when it was shared. But she had known, standing at that boundary line with the aspen's gold around her, and the first cold of the Colorado autumn coming down, that the man who stepped out of the trees with his rifle and his silence and his careful hands was someone who, whatever else he was entirely real. And real was what she had come west to find. William came running across the field from the house, shouting something about Margaret and a jar of preserves that had been, evidently, misappropriated. Bristol removed his arm from her shoulders and turned to look at his son with the patient attention that was his mode of fathering, and then looked back at Susan. "Your daughter," he said. "Our daughter," she corrected pleasantly, and handed him back the coffee cup and went to sort out the crisis. And behind her she heard him make a sound, a low, rumbling, contented sound, and she smiled at the mountains and kept walking. It was not quite a grunt. It was something better than a grunt. It was the sound of a man who had found the life he did not know he was building toward, one careful, deliberate piece at a time, and found it to be sufficient, and more than sufficient, and exactly right.